Life in Millbrook used to be simple. Everyone knew everyone, and the biggest drama we had was when old Mr. Peterson's dog would dig up someone's garden. I was there when it all changed, when our quiet little slice of American life turned into something from a nightmare. As a former military medic turned civilian nurse, I thought I'd seen the worst humanity had to offer. I was wrong. The outbreak started slowly at first. A few isolated cases that seemed like nothing more than a severe flu. People complained of headaches, disorientation, high fever, but then the aggression started. The first real warning sign came when David Cooper, one of our high school's star athletes, attacked his entire family during dinner. By the time police arrived, his parents and younger sister were critically injured, and David was found crouched in a corner, muttering incomprehensibly, his eyes glazed over with a milky film. I was working the night shift at Millbrook General when they brought them all in. Dr. Reynolds, our chief of medicine, had never seen anything like it. David's body temperature was well above what should have been fatal, and his blood work showed impossible anomalies. His muscle density had somehow increased by 30% in a matter of hours, and his skin had developed a strange, mottled texture. But the real horror started when David's victims began showing the same symptoms. Within hours, the hospital had 4 more cases, then 8, then 15. The infection spread with frightening speed, and each new case seemed to progress faster than the last. By midnight, we had to convert the entire East Wing into an isolation ward. That's when the military arrived. They came without warning, black helicopters and armored vehicles rolling into our quiet town in the dead of night. Their response was too quick, too organized. They knew exactly what they were looking for, which meant this wasn't the first time they dealt with something like this. Lieutenant James Cooper took charge of the operation, establishing a perimeter around the town with frightening efficiency, no one in or out. Those were his orders. He claimed it was for our protection, to prevent the spread of what he called a dangerous pathogen. But I'd served enough time in the military to recognize the look in his eyes. This wasn't about protection, this was about containment. The quarantine changed everything. Food became scarce within days. The military controlled all supplies coming into town, dispensing them with strict rationing. Communication with the outside world was cut off, phone lines dead, internet blocked, radio signals jammed. They said it was to prevent panic, but we all knew better. They were keeping something in, not out. That's when I met Dr. Amelia Wright. She came to the hospital claiming to be a virologist from the CDC, but her credentials were obviously fake. I caught her trying to access our lab after hours, examining blood samples from the infected. Instead of turning her in, I listened to what she had to say. What she told me changed everything I thought I knew about the outbreak. "This isn't natural," she explained, showing me slides of infected blood cells under the microscope. "Look at the way the virus is modifying the host DNA. It's too precise, too targeted. Someone engineered this." Before she could tell me more, we heard screams from the isolation ward. The infected had broken free. What happened next was pure chaos. These weren't the same people we'd admitted hours earlier. They moved with impossible speed and strength, their bodies twisted into something barely recognizable as human, and they were coordinating their attacks, working together like a pack of wolves. We barely made it out of the hospital alive. As we ran through the darkened streets, we could hear similar scenes playing out across town. The infection was spreading faster now, and the infected were changing, evolving. Each new case seemed to bring new horrors. Some developed extra joints that let them climb walls. Others grew tough, armor-like skin that could deflect bullets. We found shelter in an abandoned pharmacy where we met others who had survived the initial chaos. Michael Romano, a former bank robber who'd been hiding out in Millbrook when everything went down. Tom and Lisa Richards, trying to protect their 6-year-old daughter Emma from the nightmare our town had become. We were strangers thrown together by circumstance, but we quickly realized we'd need each other to survive. Dr. Wright told us everything she knew. She had worked for a secret government research facility studying experimental bioweapons. When she discovered what they were really doing, creating viruses that could rewrite human DNA, she tried to expose them. They tried to silence her, but she escaped with crucial data about their experiments. She had tracked their activities to Millbrook, but arrived too late to prevent the outbreak. This is just the beginning, she warned us. The virus isn't just infecting people, it's changing them. Every new generation of infected is more advanced than the last. They're learning, adapting, becoming something new, and I think that's exactly what they wanted. The first week of quarantine was the hardest. We fortified the pharmacy as best we could, using Michael's expertise in breaking into places to help us secure it against break-ins. The infected roamed the streets in growing numbers, and each day they seemed more organized, more purposeful in their movements. I remember the night we first realized how much they'd changed. We were doing a supply run to the local grocery store. Food was running low, and we needed medical supplies. Tom and I took point while Michael watched our backs. The streets were eerily quiet, the kind of silence that makes your skin crawl. We found the store's front entrance blocked by fallen debris, so we had to go in through the loading dock. That's when we saw it. A group of infected, working together to set up an ambush. They weren't just mindlessly wandering anymore. They had positioned themselves strategically, some hiding behind shelves, others up in the rafters. They were hunting us. They're evolving faster than anyone could have predicted, Dr. Wright said when we reported back. She had set up a makeshift lab in the pharmacy's back room, using whatever equipment we could salvage from the hospital. The virus isn't just affecting their bodies, it's rewiring their brains, creating new neural pathways. They're developing a hive mind. Lisa, who had been a pharmacist before the outbreak, helped Dr. Wright with her research. Her knowledge of medications proved invaluable as they worked to understand the virus's mechanism. Meanwhile, her husband Tom turned out to be skilled at organizing our supplies and planning defense strategies. Their daughter Emma became our group's heart, her resilience in the face of horror giving us all strength to keep going. But it wasn't just the infected we had to worry about. The military's presence grew more oppressive with each passing day. Their patrols became more frequent, more aggressive. They weren't just containing us anymore, they were studying us. We'd see them taking notes, setting up monitoring equipment, documenting how the infection spread through the population. One night, during a particularly dangerous supply run to the hospital's abandoned research wing, we found something that changed everything. Hidden in Dr. Reynolds' office was a classified military file, accidentally left behind in the chaos of the initial outbreak. Inside were documents that made our blood run cold. Detailed plans for the infection, predictions about how it would spread, even statistics about expected casualty rates. This wasn't an accident. Our town had been chosen. Look at these dates, Dr. Wright said, her hands trembling as she read through the papers. They had this planned months in advance. The quarantine protocols, the containment procedures, everything was ready before the first person even got infected. But the real shock came when we found a map marked with other locations. Dozens of towns across the country, each one marked as a potential test site. Millbrook wasn't their first experiment, and it wouldn't be their last. Michael found another document, this one detailing something called Phase 2. It described genetic modifications, enhanced mutations, controlled evolution. They weren't just studying the infection, they were directing it, pushing it towards some specific goal. They're playing God, Lisa whispered, holding Emma closer, trying to create something new. That's when we heard the helicopters, more of them than usual, their searchlights sweeping the streets. But they weren't looking for infected, they were searching for us. Someone had noticed the missing files. We barely made it back to our hideout, dodging both military patrols and packs of infected. But something was different about the infected we saw that night. Some of them had developed new features, bony protrusions that looked like armor, elongated limbs that let them move in impossible ways, and their eyes showed intelligence. They watched us, assessed us, planned their attacks with frightening precision. Dr. Wright spent all night studying the documents we'd recovered. By morning, she was pale with horror. "This is worse than I thought," she said. The virus, the mutations, the military presence, it's all part of something bigger, something they call Project Evolution. They're not trying to contain this outbreak, they're cultivating it. Tom, who had been keeping watch by the window, suddenly called us over. Down in the street, we saw something that confirmed our worst fears. A military patrol was leading a pack of infected, controlling them somehow. The creatures moved in perfect formation, responding to hand signals from the soldiers. Whatever was happening in our town, the military wasn't just observing anymore, they were directing it. But that wasn't even the worst part. As we watched, one of the infected turned and looked directly at our window. Its face was twisted, barely human anymore, but its eyes were clear and focused. And in them, we saw something that chilled us to our cores. Recognition. They weren't just getting smarter, they were remembering who they used to be. We knew then that we had to do something, not just for ourselves or for our town, but for all the other places marked on that map. Whatever the military was creating here, whatever they were turning people into, it had to be stopped. But as we would soon discover, some secrets are better left buried and some questions have answers too horrible to comprehend. Dr. Reynolds, who'd been treating colds and minor injuries in this town for 20 years, looked completely baffled. The boy's temperature was through the roof, and his skin had a strange, mottled appearance. When we tried to draw blood for tests, it took 3 of us to hold him down. That's when things got worse. He broke free and lunged at Dr. Reynolds, biting a chunk right out of his arm. I'd served as a military medic before settling into civilian life, and I'd seen my share of violent incidents, but this was different. There was something unnatural about the way the boy moved, the sounds he made, almost animalistic. Security managed to restrain him, but by then, Dr. Reynolds was already showing similar symptoms. Within hours, we had 4 more cases. The military arrived that evening, full tactical gear, armored vehicles, the works. They surrounded the town before most people even knew what was happening. I recognized the efficiency of their operation. This wasn't some hastily assembled response team. They knew exactly what they were doing, and that scared me more than anything else. Lieutenant James Cooper was their commanding officer, at least the one they put forward to talk to us. He assured everyone it was just a precautionary measure, that they were here to help contain what they claimed was a dangerous pathogen. But I'd spent enough time in the service to read between the lines. The way they set up their perimeter, the types of weapons they carried. This wasn't a medical quarantine, this was a combat operation. Within days, the infection spread like wildfire. People who were perfectly healthy would suddenly turn violent, attacking their own family members. The infected didn't just die, they changed. Their bodies could take incredible amounts of damage and keep going, and they seemed to operate on pure aggressive instinct. At first, anyway. That's when I met Dr. Amelia Wright, a virologist who claimed she used to work for a government research facility. She was desperate to get to the hospital's lab, convinced she could help figure out what was happening. I decided to help her. What choice did we have? The military wasn't letting anyone in or out, and their communication with us became increasingly sparse. We weren't alone. There was Michael, a former bank robber who'd been lying low in town when everything went down. He knew how to handle himself in a crisis, and despite his past, he proved to be one of the most reliable people in our group. Then there were Tom and Lisa Richards, trying to protect their 6-year-old daughter Emma in this nightmare. Tom was a high school teacher, Lisa a pharmacist. Normal people thrust into an impossible situation. The infected were evolving. We first noticed it when they started setting up ambushes. They weren't just mindless anymore. They coordinated, they planned. I watched through binoculars one afternoon as a group of them herded a survivor right into a trap. They were learning, adapting, and that's when Dr. Wright dropped the first bombshell. "This isn't natural evolution," she said one night, reviewing her lab results. "The virus is engineered. The way it affects neural pathways, the speed of mutation. Someone designed this." She showed us her findings, pages of medical jargon that basically added up to one terrifying conclusion. This wasn't an accident. Someone wanted this to happen. The military's presence started to make more sense. They weren't here to save us. They were containing their experiment. Every supply drop, every interaction was carefully controlled. They were watching us, studying how the virus spread, how it changed its hosts. We were lab rats in their maze. But that wasn't even the worst part. During one of our supply runs to the abandoned pharmacy, we found military documents that Lisa recognized. Hidden beneath all the medical supplies was a classified folder, and what we found inside chilled us to the bone. The virus wasn't the endgame, it was just the first phase of something called Project Evolution. We needed answers and we knew where to find them. On the outskirts of town, there was a facility that had always been off limits, supposedly a water treatment plant. But the military's presence there was too heavy for something so mundane. We had to get inside, had to know what they were really doing to our town. That's when everything got so much worse. Getting into the facility wasn't the hard part. Michael's criminal past finally proved useful for something good. The hard part was processing what we found inside. The place was a maze of sterile white corridors and laboratories, each level requiring higher security clearance than the last. But it was on the third sub-level that we found the truth we'd been looking for, though God knows I wish we hadn't. The labs there were filled with video monitors showing footage from all over town. They'd been watching us, documenting everything. Each screen showed different locations. The grocery store where that first major outbreak happened, the school gym where so many people had tried to take shelter, even the clinic where I'd treated that first infected boy. They knew exactly how everything would play out. But it was the other labs that truly horrified us. Behind thick glass walls, we saw things that shouldn't exist. Creatures that looked almost human but weren't. The next stage of their project. Some had limbs that were too long, joints that bent the wrong way. Others had skin that seemed to shift and change color like some kind of adaptive camouflage. These weren't infected humans. They were something new entirely. Dr. Wright found the research logs, and her hands trembled as she read them. The virus was engineered to be a transitional phase, breaking down human genetic structures to prepare them for what came next. The infected weren't failed experiments, they were incubators, their bodies being slowly transformed into something else, and those who survived the longest would become the templates for these new creatures. "They're creating living weapons," she whispered, her voice breaking. "The virus doesn't just change the body, it alters the mind, makes them susceptible to control. They're building an army." That's when the alarms started blaring. They knew we were there. They had to. We'd walked right into their trap. But they weren't trying to stop us from getting in. They were keeping us from getting out. The infected were being released into the facility, dozens of them, all at once, and these weren't like the ones we'd seen in town. These were different, more evolved. Their movements were precise, calculated. They weren't just hunting us, they were herding us deeper into the facility. Tom and Lisa kept Emma between them as we moved through the corridors, trying to find another way out. Michael took point, his experience with tight situations proving invaluable, but it was Dr. Wright who noticed something strange about the infected's behavior. They weren't attacking with the same mindless aggression we'd seen before. They were coordinated, almost military in their precision. "They've done it," she said, pulling me aside as we hid in a storage room. "These aren't just infected anymore. Look at their movements. They're being controlled. Someone's directing them." She was right. Through the small window in the door, we could see them moving in formation, responding to commands we couldn't hear. The military hadn't just created a virus, they'd created a way to control its victims. Each infected person became a puppet, a soldier they could direct without risking their own personnel. But that wasn't even the worst revelation. As we made our way through the facility, we found more documents, more test results. The virus wasn't contained to our town. Small outbreaks had been engineered in other locations, each one testing different aspects of the pathogen. Our town wasn't the first experiment, it was just the most successful one. The lights went out, plunging us into darkness. Emergency generators kicked in, bathing everything in a red glow that made the whole scene even more nightmarish. And that's when we heard it. A sound that didn't come from any human throat, infected or otherwise. Something was loose in the facility with us, something from those sealed laboratories. The real horror was just beginning. In the crimson emergency lighting, we caught glimpses of movement in the shadows. Something big, something that moved in ways nothing should move. The infected that had been pursuing us suddenly retreated, backing away like wolves sensing a larger predator. Even they knew to fear whatever was hunting us now. The sound came again, closer this time. A wet, clicking noise followed by the scrape of claws on metal. Emma whimpered, and Lisa pressed her daughter's face against her shoulder, trying to keep her quiet. Tom stood protectively in front of them, though what good that would do against whatever was out there, I couldn't say. Michael found a maintenance shaft that might lead to the surface, but getting there meant crossing an open laboratory space. As we crouched in the doorway, the emergency lights flickered, and for a split second, we saw it. A twisted mass of limbs and muscle, its skin a patchwork of scales and what looked disturbingly like human flesh. It moved with terrible grace, flowing across the ceiling like a liquid shadow. "It's one of the Phase 2 subjects," Dr. Wright whispered, her scientific detachment crumbling in the face of what she was seeing. "They've accelerated the mutation process, forced evolution along a specific path. But it's unstable. Look at how the tissues aren't fully merged." She was right. As it moved, we could see places where its form seemed to ripple and shift, as if its body couldn't quite decide what shape it wanted to be. But unstable or not, it was lethal. We found that out when 2 infected burst into the lab from another entrance. The creature dropped from the ceiling, and what happened next would haunt my nightmares forever. It didn't just kill them, it absorbed them. Its flesh seemed to liquefy and flow over them, breaking them down and incorporating their mass into itself. Each time it consumed something, it grew larger, more defined. It was learning, adapting, becoming something worse with each victim. "The perfect soldier," Dr. Wright said, her voice barely audible. "It can adapt to any environment, heal from any wound by absorbing organic matter, and it retains enough intelligence to follow complex commands. This is what they wanted all along. The infected were just practice runs." We made a break for the maintenance shaft while the creature was distracted. Michael got the access panel open, and we started climbing. The shaft was narrow, the rungs slick with condensation, and every sound echoed impossibly loud in the confined space. Above us, we could see a faint light. Maybe an exit, maybe another trap. Halfway up, Emma's hand slipped on a rung. The sound of her shoe scraping against metal seemed to fill the entire shaft. We all froze, listening. For a moment, there was absolute silence. Then we heard it. That wet clicking sound coming from below us. The creature had found our escape route. "Move," I hissed. "Everyone up, now." We climbed faster, desperately trying to reach the light above us. The sounds below grew closer, accompanied by the screech of metal being torn apart. I dared to look down and immediately wished I hadn't. The creature was flowing up the shaft like living mercury, its form constantly shifting to accommodate the space. The light above us turned out to be another lab level, but this one was different. The rooms were filled with communication equipment, and on the screens we saw something that made our blood run cold. Maps showing planned outbreak sites across the country, casualty projections, containment zones. This wasn't just an experiment, it was a rehearsal. "They're going to release it everywhere," Lisa said, her face pale. "They're going to infect entire cities." But before we could process this new horror, we heard heavy boots in the corridor outside. Military personnel, real ones this time, were closing in. We were trapped between them and the creature still climbing the shaft below us. That's when Dr. Wright did something I'll never forget. She pulled a small vial from her lab coat pocket, something she must have grabbed from one of the laboratories below. The liquid inside glowed with an unnatural bluish tinge. "This is what they've been using to control them," she said, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. "It's a synthetic pheromone. The creatures are programmed to respond to it." Before any of us could stop her, she had smashed the vial against the wall. The effect was immediate and terrifying. The clicking sounds from the shaft changed, becoming more agitated. The creature burst through the floor in a spray of twisted metal and concrete, but instead of attacking us, it turned toward the corridor where the military teams were approaching. What happened next was pure chaos. We heard screaming, gunfire, the wet sounds of flesh being torn apart. Dr. Wright grabbed my arm. That won't hold them for long. We need to find the control center. Every facility like this has one. If we can access their systems, we might be able to expose what they're doing. Michael led us through the maze of corridors, away from the sounds of battle. The former criminal had an uncanny sense of direction, something he'd developed during his years of breaking into places he shouldn't. We found the control center behind a heavy security door, but the electronic lock was fried from when the power went out. Manual override was our only option. While Michael worked on the door, Tom kept watch with a rifle he'd taken from one of the fallen soldiers. Lisa had fashioned a makeshift bandage for Emma's scraped knee from her shirt sleeve, whispering reassuring words to her daughter. The girl hadn't made a sound since the shaft. She seemed to understand that silence meant survival. The door finally opened with a hydraulic hiss, revealing a room full of computers and monitoring equipment. Dr. Wright went straight to work, her fingers flying over the keyboards. "They've been collecting data from every test site," she said, her voice tight with concentration. "Not just here. There are facilities like this all over the country, each one testing different aspects of the virus, different methods of control." On the screens we saw footage from other quarantine zones, towns just like ours, their populations being systematically infected and studied. But our town had been different. We were the first success, the first place where the virus had evolved exactly as they wanted it to. "Look at this." Dr. Wright pointed to a file labeled Project Evolution, Phase 3. "They're not just creating weapons. They're trying to force the next step in human evolution. These creatures, the infected, they're just the beginning. They want to create a new species entirely, one they can control." A deep rumble shook the building, and dust rained down from the ceiling. Whatever was happening with the creature and the military teams, it was getting closer. We could hear the sounds of combat moving through the facility, punctuated by inhuman shrieks and human screams. "Got it," Dr. Wright said suddenly. "I've accessed their main server. Everything. The research data, the test results, the location of every facility. It's all here. If we can get this information out, they won't be able to hide what they've done." But as she reached for the data transfer controls, alarms began blaring throughout the facility. A computerized voice echoed through the speakers. "Warning, site containment protocols initiated. Facility sterilization will commence in 15 minutes. Tom looked at us, his face grim. "They're going to destroy the evidence. And us with it." That's when we heard something that made our hearts stop. The sound of heavy military boots approaching from both directions. We were cornered in the control room. The data we needed to expose the truth was right in front of us, and time was running out. But worse than the footsteps was the wet, clicking sound that accompanied them. They hadn't killed the creature. They had finally gained control of it.